Hello, thanks for being here. What I want to talk about in this video is quite personal, but will no doubt aim to have some wider relevance. And that is, I want to talk about how I got into UCL as a postgraduate. I came from a single parent family in a council flat. I'm a little ashamed to bring it up. However, knowing that shame is a negative feeling, that I should really try and shake it off, I will bring it up. After all, lower socioeconomic status has an arbitrary relationship, a random relationship, or even no relationship at all to doing the work of performance, competence, or being a better person. All these things maybe to get into a place like UCL, but also just for the sake of doing them, so that you can be a better friend, or so on. I was a fairly unexceptional student, but I eventually pursued what I wanted to do, and I was given some chances to do that as an undergraduate that took in a lot more working class students. So I ended up doing English and then doing an MA in education at UCL. So I want to offer a kind of part sort of telling of my story, but maybe not too much of it, and part drawing from other videos where they say what they've learned from editing a lot of admissions essays and put this into a very local context of UCL. So I'll aim to be short and sweet. I will just say at the front of this video, I've just watched the BBC documentary How to Crack the Glass Ceiling with Amol Rajan, and one academic in there explains how a successful technique in a job interview with someone from a higher class background can be by caricaturing difference, which is highlighting your lower status and asking an employer to buy into being part of this sort of rags to riches story. There's obviously not any interviews, at least not for this MA education program, but there may be for other UCL courses. I'll explain why I'm mentioning it in just a second. This approach is arguably a little bit demeaning, and it also turns out to be a gendered one, as we learn later in the documentary that working class women are more likely to want to conceal their backgrounds. I mention it because there were a few people on the course, a handful of people on the course really, that I encountered who had gone to prestigious Sevenoaks School, although I'd found this out later through my own snooping, I'm ashamed to say. Most of the cohort, I think I would estimate maybe 75% of the 250 students, were international students, and they came mostly from East Asia, including China and Korea, although there were some people from the Americas as well. And obviously universities are attracted by the fact, I would say, most people would say, that they pay more than the UK home students for the same course. In fairness, many of the people I did meet didn't reveal their sort of backgrounds to me. In fact, two of the people that I can think of on that course, one went to Cambridge and one went to Oxford as an undergraduate, and they didn't mention it. Maybe they mentioned it to other people, but they'd assumed fairly quote-unquote normal disguises, and this was reflected in the way they dressed. There are maybe a few reasons for this. Maybe they're just sensible, grounded people who don't want to announce that they went to such a place for university. They don't want to be gauche. Maybe this is for slightly more cynical reasons, so that their brilliance may shine all the more through that contrast. But I just mention it because despite having normal peers, this obviously doesn't mean that the old class-based distinctions have gone away, or that people can't be haughty sometimes for reasons that you don't quite understand. Maybe I'm just annoying, and I'll understand that. In fairness, I didn't talk much about my background or at all really. And obviously because I'm from the southeast of England, from the outer edges of London, and I have a fairly sort of received pronunciation voice, a slightly posher accent, and having the skin colour that I do, I had fewer things to overcome with the sort of accent or racial biases of others. Okay, so that's at the front of the video. So back to more of the how-to of getting into UCL as a postgraduate there. So it's sometimes said, anecdotally, that it is easier to get into more prestigious universities for postgraduate programs. And this is partly true, I think, because you will already have the example of your undergraduate efforts. If you have a first or a high 2-1, and if you have a certain research interest that's at the preferred university that you're applying to, and there's an academic that you're thinking of when you're applying, it may be far easier to claim that you have lots to contribute in seminars and lectures. If you don't, then it may be far harder to get into your preferred university. So, although the relationship of students to the so-called neoliberal university is transactional, it involves pounds and pennies in this case, there's obviously the other transaction involved in saying what you can offer to the life of the university, to the course, if you were involved in sort of societies and organisations and as an undergraduate as well. I think I also chose a master's that was slightly out of the way and slightly less in demand, and that was, as I said, the MA in education at the IOE, the Institute of Education. It was a great experience, but it's also worth saying that we can't assume that what we're trying to fit into or assimilate into is always superior. Sometimes the teaching quality is quite variable. I always thought it was very good, but if you want to work hard, you can do this in lots of places, and there are some great academics and at all sorts of institutions. not just the sort of Russell group ones. Moving on now to sort of the ratio between applications to actual intake, I think that's worth paying attention to. And this ratio is usually published on the course page, even if it is a postgraduate taught or research program. I've just had a look at the course page of the MA Education, and it's no longer there. A few years ago it was. This is something admissions people may be happy to offer if you email them nicely enough, I think. But obviously just for the purposes of illustration, if there are 1,000 applicants and 100 places, that will give you a sense of the competitiveness of a course. I'm not sure how many applicants that there were for my course, but there were about 250 people on the specific education course that I chose. And some of these were taking the smaller pathways like the early years education MA. And they were doing the compulsory sort of modules as well that we will share, like what is education, understanding research. I think it's also worth saying that UCL, across its many sites around London, which includes the Bloomsbury campus, but also now UCL East in Stratford, and the sort of specialised medical campuses in Stanmore or Old Street for ophthalmology, means that it has almost 44,000 students, of which almost 20,000 are undergraduates and almost 24,000 are postgraduates. And that's a huge number compared to other universities. And it also means there's potentially a larger chance to get in. As for personal statements, I've edited only a few, and I've gone back to look at mine in preparation for this video. And I sort of cringe and dreading showing it, so I'm not going to, but I will discuss the things I think went wrong with it. Instead, I really like a video from someone on YouTube called Danielle Dupreez. The title is, I edited 500 plus college admissions essays and this is what I've learned. This will have more value than what I can say because it's a sort of more representative sample, but I will try and take the liberty of trying to tweak this advice for for UCL, for the context of UCL and postgraduate admissions as I experienced it a few years ago when I got in 2018. So she explains that after editing 500 essays, she finally has a legitimate judgment on what is cliche and what is not cliche. And she also sort of warns about using the word passion, for example, because it's so overused. And that's really fair enough. I'm sure you are aware of that. I think that's talks about a lot. The rhetoric of changing the world in the future comes into her crosshairs for similar reasons. So she also adds, and this is a fairly long quote, but I think it's worth talking about when it comes to adding your experiences. I just want to clarify, I guess, that for a lot of people, when they're writing their college essays, it's like a very interesting moment where they've never really reflected on the value of their life so far. And there are some interesting consequences of that, including that people talk about things that they've never talked about before or never explained the importance of to anyone else. So as a result, people will address really sensitive topics. And sometimes that just doesn't come across in the way I think that they intend it to. So if I throw out this video, I'm talking about people who are addressing those sensitive topics. It's not because I don't believe in the uniqueness of that experience, but more like I've seen people attempt to include or talk about those things over and over. And there is only so much that's possible to do in 650 words or 500 words, depending on where you're applying. I think it is worth keeping in mind, and this is me talking now, that experience should be relevant to the course you're applying for, and this might be formative life experiences with a clear link to the course. Perhaps it might also include things like internships or previous work experience. Danielle warns against the suffering immigrant narrative, which I think is definitely important, both in the US and in the UK, but maybe not as relevant in a personal admissions statement, I think. Some people also talk about how this course will enable them in their future career. I think that's fine, but worth keeping to a minimum. Some admissions readers will take this with a grain of salt, as many people don't end up pursuing the career that they state in their statement. So I'm not going to mention any more of her video because you can go and check it out for yourself. As for how I would contextualize her advice for the particular university that I'm talking about, I would only say don't make the same mistakes I did, even though, obviously I got in. I think I was particularly lucky, but I ended up talking about citizenship education in my statement and how I wanted to pursue that in the course, and I didn't do that. What I actually ended up doing while I was there was involved building on the work I did as an undergraduate and drawing a very sort of clear line of connection to the things I had written as an undergraduate. And this was things to do with sort of post-colonial and global literature, English education in the classroom, things with a slightly political bent to them, and the work I was doing as a tutor at the time, both paid and unpaid kind of work. And I did mention that in the statement, I think. So I'm glad I did mention it. I think above all, and I know it's a much discussed idea, I would say authenticity is key. And that means not going and applying just because the university is well known and you're chasing status. And I think that was definitely true for me to some extent. But I think now looking back on it with the benefit of some hindsight over a few years, I think going in and applying knowing that at least some of what you're applying for will excite you is important, and some of what I was applying for did excite me. As Guy Durden, one of the lecturers on the course, said when he was discussing essays, if it's a drudge, then what's the point? I would slightly disagree with that. Obviously, studying involves a lot of drudgery to get what you want. Maybe that's polished essays, maybe it's just a means to an end to get the grade. I would agree generally, though, that there should be more than some moments where you're excited to dive deeper into what you've decided to do. So I think that's it for now. Thank you so much for watching, obviously, and good luck with your statements. Thank you very much.